Hello, everyone. It is Monday, April 19th, 2021. We are in the midst of this beautiful book called the Bible. My name is Bria Doan. This is Fit Your Ministries, where we go through the Bible one day at a time, chronologically in the year 2021. We are finishing up the book of 1 Samuel today and starting a new book, 2 Samuel. So here we will read about David and these Amalekites. Y'all, I wish I should really do the math and look at how many years, how many centuries actually have the Israelites been dealing with these Amalekites. And remember that God called them to destroy the Amalekites. And now, we see them continuing to pilfer and penetrate the ways of the Israelites. And if they had just done what they had been called to do centuries before, what would their lives have been like? So as we read today, I want you to think about, because we see victory today, so I want you to think about what is it that you need victory over today? What is it that God has called you to destroy, but you're still holding on to it? You're not holding on to it as greatly as you did before. It's not as big as it was before, but there's still a little thorn of it in your heart, in your mind. What is it that we need to surrender to the will of God and destroy it once and for all? So I want you to have that in the back of your mind as we read today's uplifting message in the book of 1 Samuel. We do have quite a bit of jumping back and forth between 1 Samuel and Chronicles. So if you want to go ahead and mark your books, we will be finishing the book of 1 Samuel. So go ahead and mark that. And then 1 Chronicles, we're going to kind of be all over the place. We're going to start in chapter 3. We're going to read verses 1 through 4. Then we're going to go back to 1 Samuel, back to 1 Chronicles, chapter 10, verses 1 through 14, and chapter 9, verses 40 through 44, before moving into 2 Samuel. So if you're in a traditional Bible by the book, then you just might want to mark those pages for yourself. And with that, let's get going. Feel free to pause if you need a little bit of extra time to mark your pages. 1 Samuel chapter 30. 3 days later, when David and his men arrived home at their town of Ziklag, they found that the Amalekites had made a raid into the Negev and Ziklag. They had crushed Ziklag and burned it to the ground. They had carried off the women and children and everyone else, but without killing anyone. When David and his men saw the ruins and realized what had happened to their families, they wept until they could weep no more. David's 2 wives, Ahinoam from Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal from Carmel, were among those captured. David was now in great danger because all his men were very bitter about losing their sons and daughters, and they began to talk about stoning him. But David found strength in the Lord his God. Then he said to Abiathar the priest, "Bring me the ephod." So Abiathar brought it. Then David asked the Lord, "Should I chase after this band of raiders? Will I catch them?" And the Lord told him, "Yes, go after them. You will surely recover everything that was taken from you." So David and his 600 men set out, and they came to the brook Besor. But 200 of the men were too exhausted to cross the brook. So David continued the pursuit with 400 men. Along the way, they found an Egyptian man in a field and brought him to David. They gave him some bread to eat and water to drink. They also gave him part of a fig cake and 2 clusters of raisins, for he hadn't had anything to eat or drink for 3 days and nights. Before long, his strength returned. "To whom do you belong, and where do you come from?" David asked him. "I am an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite," he replied. "My master abandoned me 3 days ago because I was sick. We were on our way back from raiding the Kerethites in the Negev, the territory of Judah, and the land of Caleb, and we had just burned Ziklag." "Will you lead me to this band of raiders?" David asked. The young man replied, "If you take an oath in God's name that you will not kill me or give me back to my master, then I will guide you to them." So he led David to them, and they found the Amalekites spread out across the fields, eating and drinking and dancing with joy because of the vast amount of plunder they had taken from the Philistines and the land of Judah. David and his men rushed in among them and slaughtered them throughout the night and the entire next day until evening. None of the Amalekites escaped except 400 young men who fled on camels. David got back everything the Amalekites had taken, and he rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, small or great, son or daughter, nor anything else that had been taken. David brought everything back. He also recovered all the flocks and herds, and his men drove them ahead of the other livestock. "This plunder belongs to David," they said. Then David returned to the brook Besor and met up with the 200 men who had been left behind because they were too exhausted to go with him. They went out to meet David and his men, and David greeted them joyfully. But some evil troublemakers among David's men said, "They didn't go with us, so they can't have any of the plunder we recovered. Give them their wives and children and tell them to be gone." But David said, "No, my brothers, don't be selfish with what the Lord has given us. He has kept us safe and helped us defeat the band of raiders that attacked us. Who will listen when you talk like this? We share and share alike, those who go to battle and those who guard the equipment." From then on, David made this a decree and regulation for Israel, and it is still followed today. When he arrived at Ziklag, David sent part of the plunder to the elders of Judah, who were his friends. "Here is a present for you, taken from the Lord's enemies," he said. The gifts were sent to the people of the following towns David had visited: Bethel, Ramoth Negev, Jatir, Aror, Siphmoth, Eshtemoa, Rakal, the towns of the Jerahmeelites, and the towns of the Kenites, Hormah, Or Ashan, Atach, Hebron, and all the other places David and his men had visited. 1 Chronicles chapter 12, verses 20 through 22. Here is a list of the men from Manasseh who defected to David as he was returning to Ziklag: Adnah, Jozabad, Jediel, Michael, Jozabad, Elihu, and Zilethai. Each commanded 1,000 troops from the tribe of Manasseh. They helped David chase down bands of raiders, for they were all brave and able warriors who became commanders in his army. Day after day, more men joined David until he had a great army like the army of God. 1 Samuel chapter 31, verses 1 through 13. Now the Philistines attacked Israel, and the men of Israel fled before them. Many were slaughtered on the slopes of Mount Gilboa. The Philistines closed in on Saul and his sons, and they killed 3 of his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and the Philistines' archers caught up with him and wounded him severely. Saul groaned to his armor-bearer, "Take your sword and kill me before these pagan Philistines come to run me through and taunt and torture me." But his armor-bearer was afraid and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When his armor-bearer realized that Saul was dead, he fell on his own sword and died beside the king. So Saul, his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and his troops all died together that day. When the Israelites on the other side of Jezreel Valley and beyond the Jordan saw that the Israelite army had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their towns and fled. So the Philistines moved in and occupied their towns. The next day, when the Philistines went out to strip the dead, they found the bodies of Saul and his 3 sons on Mount Gilboa. So they cut off Saul's head and stripped off his armor. Then they proclaimed the good news of Saul's death in their pagan temple and to the people throughout the land of Philistia. They placed his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths, and they fastened his body to the wall of the city of Bethshan. But when the people of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their mighty warriors traveled through the night to Bethshan and took the bodies of Saul and his sons down from the wall. They brought them to Jabesh, where they burned the bodies. Then they took their bones and buried them beneath the tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and they fasted for 7 days. 1 Chronicles chapter 10, verses 1 through 14. Now the Philistines attacked Israel, and the men of Israel fled before them. Many were slaughtered on the slopes of Mount Gilboa. The Philistines closed in on Saul and his sons, and they killed 3 of his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew very fierce around Saul, and the Philistine archers caught up with him and wounded him. Saul groaned to his armor-bearer, "Take your sword and kill me before these pagan Philistines come to taunt and torture me." But his armor-bearer was afraid and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When his armor-bearer realized that Saul was dead, he fell on his own sword and died. So Saul and his 3 sons died there together, bringing his dynasty to an end. When all the Israelites in the Jezreel Valley saw that their army had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their towns and fled. So the Philistines moved in and occupied their towns. The next day, when the Philistines went out to strip the dead, they found the bodies of Saul and his sons on Mount Gilboa. So they stripped off Saul's armor and cut off his head. Then they proclaimed the good news of Saul's death before their idols and to the people throughout the land of Philistia. They placed his armor in the temple of their gods, and they fastened his head to the temple of Dagon. But when everyone in Jabesh Gilead heard about everything the Philistines had done to Saul, all their mighty warriors brought the bodies of Saul and his sons back to Jabesh. Then they buried the bones beneath the great tree at Jabesh, and they fasted for 7 days. So Saul died because he was unfaithful to the Lord. He failed to obey the Lord's command, and he even consulted a medium instead of asking the Lord for guidance. So the Lord killed him and turned the kingdom over to David, son of Jesse. 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 1 through 27. After the death of Saul, David returned from his victory over the Amalekites and spent 2 days in Ziklag. On the 3rd day, a man arrived from Saul's army camp. He had torn his clothes and put dirt on his head to show that he was in mourning. He fell to the ground before David in deep respect. "Where have you come from?" David asked. "I escaped from the Israelite camp," the man replied. "What happened?" David demanded. "Tell me how the battle went." The man replied, "Our entire army fled from the battle. Many of the men are dead, and Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead." "How do you know Saul and Jonathan are dead?" David demanded of the young man. The man answered, "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear with the enemy chariots and charioteers closing in on him. When he turned and saw me, he cried out for me to come to him. 'How can I help?' I asked him. He responded, 'Who are you?' 'I am an Amalekite,' I told him. Then he begged me, 'Come over here and put me out of my misery, for I am in terrible pain and want to die.' So I killed him," the Amalekite told David, "for I knew he couldn't live. Then I took his crown and his armband, and I have brought them here to you, my lord." David and his men tore their clothes in sorrow when they heard the news. They mourned and wept and fasted all day for Saul and his son Jonathan and for the Lord's army and the nation of Israel, because they had died by the sword that day. Then David said to the young man who had brought the news, "Where are you from?" And he replied, "I am a foreigner, an Amalekite who lives in your land." "Why were you not afraid to kill the Lord's anointed one?" David asked. Then David said to one of his men, "Kill him." So the man thrust his sword into the Amalekite and killed him. "You have condemned yourself," David said, "for you yourself confessed that you killed the Lord's anointed one." Then David composed a funeral song for Saul and Jonathan, and he commanded that it be taught to the people of Judah. It is known as the Song of the Bow, and it is recorded in the book of Jashar. "Your pride and joy, O Israel, lies dead on the hills. Oh, how the mighty heroes have fallen. Don't announce the news in Gath. Don't proclaim it in the streets of Ashkelon, or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice, and the pagans will laugh in triumph. O mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor fruitful fields producing offerings of grain. For there the shield of the mighty heroes was defiled. The shield of Saul will be no longer anointed with oil. The bow of Jonathan was powerful, and the sword of Saul did its mighty work. They shed the blood of their enemies and pierced the bodies of mighty heroes. How beloved and gracious Saul and Jonathan were. They were together in life and in death. They were swifter than eagles, stronger than lions. O women of Israel, weep for Saul, for he dressed you in luxurious scarlet clothing, in garments decorated with gold. Oh, how the mighty heroes have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies dead on the hills. How I weep for you, my brother Jonathan. Oh, how much I loved you, and your love for me was deep, deeper than the love of women. Oh, how the mighty heroes have fallen. Stripped of their weapons, they lie dead. Well, today was not a boring day in our Bible reading. There's actually so much good stuff here for us to take away. But I'm just going to share a couple of things that I don't want just to kind of go in one ear and out the other. So remember, we talked about the Amalekites, and here we see the Amalekites coming in and wreaking havoc on David's town of Ziklag, where he lived with all of his people. And so they were taken, and David, before he does anything, he seeks the will of God. And he knows that he can't go to the tabernacle. Why? Because Saul's there. That's in the land that Saul lives. And remember, Saul is still chasing after David. Like, Saul has not given up here. And so he calls the priest, and he needs the Urim and the Thummim so that he can have that yes-no response from God as to what he is supposed to do here. And God says, go, and I will, he's with him, and he will make sure that he is successful. And so David goes. One thing I want you to notice is that the people, when he comes back with his army and they see that their wives and children and the town has been burned down, they turn on David and they get mad at him. They want to kill him. And he's like, wait, let's ask the Lord. And then they all come back together. They go and they fight. And then what do they say at the very end? That all of the plunder belongs to David. Like, in this instance, I see humanity. I see humanity at its rawness. I see humanity at its core, and just how we can flip-flop, and how the winds of change can just change our minds from this way and that way and this way. And David just again shows us the patience and the just perseverance to stand in his ground and say, no, we're going to do this the right way. That, I don't know if it does it for any of you guys, but that brings peace. That brings peace to my body. That I don't have to listen to what the world tells me to do, and I don't have to go this way and that and actually act on my emotions. That I can take a breath, seek God, and then move forward. That pause, ponder, and pray, guys. If we could do that, so much of our distress, I think, would resolve itself. But here we read about the death of Saul. And so part of me is like, okay, yeah, finally, Saul's gone. Poor David won't be chased anymore. But there is a sadness to it, He was anointed by God. He was called by God to be king. And it was up to God as to when Saul would be removed from his position. And that was for God to decide. And David knew that. And that becomes really important here. Now, the true story of the death of Saul is found in 1 Samuel chapter 31, when the Philistines were coming in and attacking Israel, and they had killed his sons. And Saul knows that death is imminent, like he is mortally wounded, but he doesn't want to be captured by the Philistines and taunted and tormented. So he asks his armor bearer, like, let's pay attention to this. He asks his armor bearer to kill him, to put him out of his misery. And his armor bearer says no, because his armor bearer knows that it is against God's will for him or anyone to kill an anointed man of God. So he's like, I'm keeping my hands clean. I will stay here with you, and I'm not going to do this. So Saul sees no other option but to take his own life, and he falls upon his spear himself. And at this distress, the armor bearer also takes his own life. Now they do this so that they can't be taken captured by the Philistines. But we read in 2 Samuel how David learns of the death of Saul and Jonathan. We'll go back to something else in 1 Samuel, but I want to finish this story. There is a man, an Amalekite, who comes to tell David. And he has this story. He actually says that he is an Amalekite living amongst the Israelites, that he came from the Israelite camp. But he tells him that he killed Saul, that Saul begged for his death, and he killed Saul, brought the crown and the armband to David. Now see, the armor bearer knew better, right? And David asks the question. He says, why were you not afraid to kill the Lord's anointed one? Like, okay, so Saul asked you to kill him. Why was there not the fear of the Lord your God for taking his anointed person like the armor bearer had, right? So David's like, this is not a man of God. This is a man that's just into his own. So back then there were people, and I'm sure there still are today, that after the battles they would go and they would scrounge around and take anything of value that they found. So this is probably a man who was just after the battle, before the Philistines came back to kind of go through the dead. Remember, they took Saul and his sons and put them as trophies in their land. So this man went before them and found this and went to David, probably seeking some type of honor, right? Like, oh, thank you. You did us a favor, because everybody knew that Saul was trying to kill David. But instead, David once again just stays true to the will of God, and God would never ask and never want any of us to take someone else's life, enemy or not. And lying has its own consequence. And here, this man lying cost him his life. So I feel that today's reading, much of the reading of 1 Samuel really shows us the character of David, but I feel like there's just so many glimpses in who David was, how David lived his life, and just that we can just take so much from this. So they were on their way to go find the Amalekites, right? Because the Amalekites had come and destroyed their land. And along the way, this is verse 11 of 1 Samuel chapter 30, along the way they found an Egyptian man. Now this Egyptian man was an Amalekite slave, just left for 3 days. So the Amalekites, this is why God wanted them destroyed. The Amalekites didn't care. They didn't have a real love for human life. Like, he was sick. They probably didn't want to take care of him anymore. And so they just left him there to die. So David honors this man, gives him food and drink, and asks about who he is and what he's, gone through. And then this man actually serves and helps David. This is not a coincidence. This is not just, oh, hey, look what we found here. This was a divine intersection with this man that God gave him to be able to take David, because he showed them the way to the Amalekites. God does that. He does that in our lives. He puts people in our lives, and sometimes if we're not careful and observant, we can push people to the side that God has called and has put in front of you to teach you something, to show you something, to give you something. But if we sit and look at a person and say, you don't look the way I thought you would, and therefore you can't be sent from God, it's not up to us to make that judgment. That is why God calls us to love everyone, to love others, because it is only through love that we can accept people and their purpose and not have some sort of preconceived notion that would keep us from wanting, learning, interacting with them. So just remember that everybody that comes across deserves a smile, deserves a hello. I don't know about you, but I'm just going to go off on a tangent here. I have really become aware of society and how we just walk past people. I try to make eye contact and smile, and there is just such emptiness, I guess would be a good word, or just like not even wanting to pay attention to somebody you don't know. And I just think it's really sad, because we're all in this life together, and we can all bring someone some joy, even with something as small as a smile and a hello. Sometimes that's all somebody needs. They're so close to giving up, and they just need to know that there are good people out there. So let's be those good people. So anyway, you just never know who God puts in your life, and you can't discredit anyone. Lastly, at the very end, we read a psalm, right? No, it is not a psalm. Sorry. It is 2 Samuel, and it is verses 19 through 27. And this is a beautiful song that David was a musician. Remember, he played the harp for Saul. That's how they got to know each other. And he composes this song and plays it for Saul and teaches it to the people of Judah. This is a man who was seeking to kill David for years, who would say, "Oh, son, David, my son, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. We're good." And then turn right around and be chasing after him, trying to kill him again. And here's David, this man who has made him run from his homeland, be on the run all the time, move his family, and just be in places of danger, is now dead. And David honors him with a song, and calls him a hero. I mean, that we could look at our enemies, that we could look at people who hurt us, who we feel like just want nothing but destruction for our lives, and be able to rejoice in them and ask God for blessings for them. That takes some divine intervention for certain. That's like yesterday. That takes a heart transformation. So Father, today, we all have feel like we all have enemies. We all have people that we feel are against us, people that we feel want to keep us in chains. They don't want to see us free. They don't want to help lift the burdens that we feel. And God, first, we lift those burdens to you. We take up your yoke, and we know that with you, all of our burdens are light. And then, God, we just ask that you help us to love our enemies, to call blessings upon those that we feel are against us, God. God, that you may open our hearts and our minds to perhaps their pain, because hurt people hurt people. Lord, help us to be a free person in your will, that we can go out and free other people. There is a world out there that needs an army, a Christ army, to go and set them free from the ways of the world, from the enemy that comes up against them, God. And help us to be those people. We want to be your army, the Lord's army that goes out and tells people about you, your love, your forgiveness, and just the gospel message of your Son who came and paid it all for us, God. God, thank you for that sacrifice. And if we can just look to that sacrifice as a mirror for our own lives, there is nothing that we can't sacrifice of our own lives that is more valuable than your precious Son, Jesus. God, we ask that whatever it is inside us, we just need to let go of. God, you brought victory to David for the Amalekites. We ask for victory today. We ask for freedom today. Those of you that are out there and you just have hurting hearts, you have generational curses that are weighing upon you. God, we ask for freedom and from those. We ask that you show another way for us to live, God. That we do not have to perpetuate the ways of our family. That we can choose different. We can choose to be different. We can choose to love differently. We need your help for that. God, bring an awareness for us so that we know where change needs to happen. And then give us the courage to make those changes. And help us to forgive ourselves when we revert back sometimes. We love you, we praise you, and we look forward to all of the chains that you break today and every day, God. Thank you for being a chain breaker and a way maker for all of us in our lives. We pray for all these things in your name, Lord. Amen. Friends, I really do pray that for every single one of you. We all have something in our lives that we need freedom from. And give it to God. He's ready. He's able. You can trust in His mighty strength to do what you can't do on your own. All right. I wish you a most blessed and wonderful day. And my name is Bria Doan. This has been Fit Shore Ministries. And until tomorrow, bye guys. Love you all.